The Conservatives are not really focusing on a growth-based strategy. The central emphasis for them is tax cuts. They are obsessed with calling themselves the guys who are going to cut taxes. How are they going to do that? Well, the Conservative and Unionist Party, fairly old party, started by a guy called Robert Peel, Sir Robert Peel, I'm sorry, who also actually was the founder of the Metropolitan Police in London. That's why they're called Bobbies, because Robert, Bob, Bobby. They are definitely the party that's had the most power in recent British history. I think out of the last 120 years, since the Labour Party was formed, 1900, Conservatives have been in power for most of that time, like by far. This is their country. And now they are getting absolutely rammed in the polls. Look at this. They are actually neck and neck, potentially even trailing at times, their further right counterparts, Reform UK. They've only got like a sort of 7 or 6 point lead against the Liberal Democrats. They've been in power for 14 years. They've had 5 prime ministers in that time. They've had all kinds of scandals and shenanigans. Brexit got rid of Trump. The failure to hold her majority government against Jeremy Corbyn got rid of Theresa May. Boris Johnson, because I mean, how many things? How many broken rules around COVID restrictions? Promoting a guy who was known for sexual misconduct called Chris Pincher and joking about it. Liz Truss with the mini budget, a very Thatcher-esque attempt at economic daredevilry that got her absolutely destroyed. And now we've got Rishi Sunak. So they're not having a good time right now. Not good at all. But we should go over their manifesto anyway, because although they're definitely not going to win, and they've more or less accepted that they're not going to win, they're just trying to do damage control right now. That's why they tell you that the best you can do is stop a Labour supermajority by voting for Conservative. Just so you guys know, supermajority in the United Kingdom means absolutely nothing. We are a first-past-the-post parliamentary democracy. Once you have a majority of the seats, 51%, you can do whatever the fuck you want, basically. You can pass whatever legislation you want so long as your party is well whipped, which they usually are. So the difference between a 52% majority and a 90% majority in terms of legislation is not that different. Symbolically, it might be different, but in terms of legislation, no actual differences, no. No technical differences anyway. So, Conservatives do have a manifesto, though. And I think it does tell you a few interesting things about how manifestos work. If you've ever heard the phrase, fully costed manifesto. This is a thing that's been going around. The concept actually came from, it's fairly old. It was popularized definitely massively by Jeremy Corbyn, because his whole thing in the Labour Party's thing at that time was to say, we need to show people that left-wingers can be fiscally responsible. We can give you good stuff, but we can pay for it through taxes and growth-based borrowing plans. So they pushed this line that their manifesto was fully costed. Other people thought it wasn't necessary to fully cost manifestos. They thought manifestos were supposed to be that you present a kind of vibe and then you kind of riff around that based on the circumstances of the time. But now, fully costed, they're all saying it. The problem is it means absolutely nothing. Okay? Fully costed manifesto, at least in this election, means nothing. Let me demonstrate. Let's say I am a political candidate and I've got a big plan, okay? It's called the green-based plan, okay? Based in green. Okay? It's going to cost 50 billion. And it's going to pay for X number of windmills, wind turbines. No, turbines are 3 blades, aren't they? It's going to pay for, wind turbines and solar, all this kind of nonsense, right? Green Britain, whoop. With some little figures here, okay? We're going to get, a whole bunch of these. We're going to get a bunch of these. Okay. And we're going to pay for it by doing a carbon tax. Okay? We're going to tax people who extra for engaging in forms of energy use and production that leave a carbon footprint. So we're going to do a carbon tax. That's going to pay for this. It's going to give us this money, and this money is going to pay for this, okay? That's a fully costed manifesto proposal right there. Boom. However, what I haven't told you is a couple of things. One is that no expert in the field believes you can pay for all of this with this. Actually, you know what? Let's throw in some jobs as well. We're going to put in some jobs. And the person can be holding a spade because that's a job. No expert has actually said that you can pay for all of this with this much money, right? They're all saying it might actually cost twice as much or 3 times as much. Doesn't matter. The fully costed manifesto. This is actually what they do. I'll show you in a minute. What I also haven't told you is that this carbon tax, which is expected to raise 50 billion in the set period of time, no one agrees that it'll necessarily raise that much either, because it's fundamentally flawed. It's flawed for a few reasons. Let's think about how carbon tax works. The idea of carbon tax is that you tax people who engage in carbon emissions, and you raise money from it, but you also want to deter that practice. You want people to move their investments towards this stuff, towards green stuff. So the problem with a carbon tax is you can't really make long-term predictions on it as a reliable source of revenue, because if your carbon tax works, less people will use carbon emission stuff. So less people will pay the tax. People will move away from the thing that you're taxing. That's what you want. You want them to move away from the thing that you're taxing, but you want to raise taxes from it. It's not a sustainable long-term plan. So on both ends, this fully costed manifesto is shit. Doesn't mean anything. It means you're going to raise some money from this thing, and it means that some of that money is going to pay for some of this, if even. And then another problem with fully costed manifestos is, let's say there's a pre-existing budget right now that actually includes a whole bunch of cuts to various public services. Well, I just don't mention them in my manifesto. Fully costed. And this is actually what they do. It's unironically, it's that simple. It's how people get away with calling it a fully costed manifesto. So in the case of the Labour Party that we've spoken about, their manifesto is largely geared towards economic growth. Keir Starmer has said, we're not going to raise most forms of taxes. We're not going to borrow any more than the current fiscal rules allow, that this government follows. And we're not going to do austerity. You've got a bunch of things you want to do, though. You have a plan for the NHS, which costs a lot more than you're planning to raise for it. You've got plans for building 300,000 houses. You've got all these plans. If you don't follow through with these, if you don't get the growth that you need or are expecting that might pay for some of this stuff, what are you going to do? And they just don't say. There are just some parts of the manifesto that aren't even mentioned. Some parts of the economy that just aren't mentioned. So are they going to cut, or are they going to raise taxes, or are they going to borrow? We can just guess. We just don't know. Fully costed manifesto. And this is why economists have described this kind of wordplay or this kind of trickery as a conspiracy of silence, because these manifestos don't necessarily have the backing in terms of like, this will pay for this. Experts tend to not agree on whether or not the thing that they're paying for can be paid for by the amount that they're raising. And they also don't agree on the manifesto as a whole, potentially. There are also other issues with like, we're going to raise this much money, but they don't say if it necessarily will be, not always, they don't say if it's going to be with inflation or if it's going to be changed with economic growth or how it's going to sustain in the long term. There's just none of this. So people have accused Labour of definitely going to do austerity. That's what people are saying, right? They might do austerity. They might not. The fiscal rules that they've signed up to include austerity because they're carrying on a lot of things that Conservatives are. So if they're not going to do austerity, they're going to have to do something to make up those costs. They're going to have to raise taxes or they're going to have to borrow. And I'm guessing they'll probably just do whatever will cost them the least in the polls when they do it. Just a guess. The Conservatives are not really focusing on a growth-based strategy. That's not the central emphasis of their manifesto. The central emphasis for them is tax cuts. They are obsessed with calling themselves the guys who are going to cut taxes. That's why, for that gap left by Labour that could be explained by borrowing, cuts, or taxes, well, the Conservatives have fully decided they're going to pay for it with taxes. So that's why Rishi Sunak in a debate with Starmer can say like 12 times, Keir Starmer is going to raise your taxes. He's going to raise it by £2,000 per person. And he's saying that because they've calculated the gap in the manifesto and they've filled it with £2,000 per person in taxes. That's it. They don't know if it's going to be borrowing or cuts. They've just said taxes because that's their party line. The Conservatives are promising a lot of cuts, quite a lot, 17 billion in tax cuts across various brackets. Now, they've promised something like this before, In 2015, they promised to cut 12 billion, to save 12 billion from welfare freezes. And they succeeded. They were 2 years late, but they succeeded to get that 12 billion. With the tax cuts, though, how are they going to do that? Well, the big thing they're going to do is they're going to reduce national insurance contributions, people paying towards national insurance. It's going to go down from 8% to 6%. For self-employed people like me, they're going to cut it completely. I pay national insurance right now. Conservatives are going to get rid of it. So under the Conservatives, assuming I earn, let's say, 35k a year, I would save just over £1,500 a year, thanks to the Conservatives, which is funny because I don't need a tax cut. I would rather pay taxes and live in a society where people are taken care of than save 1.5k a year in exchange for destroying the welfare state, personally. It's also ironic that people like me would be getting their national insurance contributions wiped out, whilst people on the minimum wage would actually be getting dragged into it. Because what they've also got is that the national insurance threshold, the amount you have to be earning to start paying it, about 12,500, is frozen, which means that over this next 5 years, the economy is going to inflate. People who are full-time minimum wage employees who don't need to pay national insurance right now, their wages will go up with inflation, at least, and they will be dragged into the tax bracket. So thanks to these Conservative tax cuts, someone like me, I could be earning like 60, 70, 80, 100k a year, and I'd get a tax cut. But a minimum wage employee, full-time, would actually see their taxes increase because they'd get dragged into the national insurance bracket. They're literally offering to take money from poor people and give it to me, which is based. Anyway, there's a few other things that are just like, for a party that's so obsessed with taxes, some things are just left completely unannounced. Like no proposed change to council taxes, even though actually most houses right now are in the wrong brackets because the system for evaluating council taxes is like 33 years out of date. The Conservatives they've changed corporation tax like 26 times during this government. So there's no guarantee that anything they're proposing will actually be stationary. There's also just another problem with the fact that it's all so underwhelming. Because compared to Labour, it doesn't make Labour much better either. The Conservatives right now, if you look at tax revenue as a share of national income based on their manifesto pledges, the Conservatives would be a little bit under the current forecast. Tax revenue would make up 36.8% of national income as opposed to 37.4 or 37. For Labour, it would be 37.4. So look at these gaps are tiny. You're talking like a less than 1% change in tax revenue as a share of national income. For Liberal Democrats, it's a bit higher. If you add in the Greens, pretty substantial difference. The Greens want to raise a lot of taxes. They want to raise wealth taxes. They want to raise carbon taxes. They want to raise windfall taxes. But these other ones, it's a very narrow difference between these two parties, mostly because Labour are playing it safe. Conservatives, they are also, in terms of public services, things are mostly staying the same. I think they've offered like a 500 million top up to public services, which is like peanuts. In real terms, that might actually mean cuts. For housing, they've got this bright idea of help to buy, which is giving people benefits and loans to buy their first house. Extra if it's a house that they currently live in from a landlord, because they're going to give like a capital gains tax exemption for landlords who are selling to tenants. Again, the problem with that is that it's not really matched by any outlined commitment to increase the building of houses. And the Tories have failed their goals for building houses every single year of the last 14 years. They promise 300,000, they tend to build like 200,000, maybe a bit over, maybe a bit under. So the problem with this is like help to buy is that you've got a limited supply that's not really increasing that highly, and you're increasing the demand. The problem is, that's going to increase the cost of housing because it might be easier for people to buy their first house, but people who are selling houses know that. And people who want to upsize have less options as well. There's a bit of a problem there. It's not really going to help the housing crisis in any single way. So it's just classic conservative bullshit. Like they haven't done any progress on housing in the last 14 years. So why would they do it now? For health, NHS is in big trouble. Partly because of the pandemic, in large part. It's not entirely the government's fault, but it was a problem before the pandemic. The NHS has been struggling to meet targets, failing to meet targets actually, for the best part of the last 10 years now. The Conservatives do this thing where they make a big noise. They make this big noise about how they're going to increase NHS spending above inflation every year. This always happens with the NHS. The NHS always, by default, almost gets increased spending above inflation. The only time they didn't was in like 1950 something, mid-1950s for like 5 years. Other than that, NHS spending always goes up with inflation. Always. The Conservative increase of NHS spending is abysmal. It's incredibly low. Their spending increase is like 1 billion, I think, maybe 1.2 billion. For context, the NHS budget for health and social care is 192 billion. It's a 0.5% increase in real terms. Labour's is 0.9% increase. These are both tiny, which is ironic because both of them have committed to what's called the workforce plan to boost the workforce numbers in the NHS to what's more required. But every economist, like I said with this, every economist agrees that you would need a 3% increase above inflation, not 0.5, not 0.9. So again, they're either going to fail to meet their targets, or they're going to have to raise taxes, or they're going to have to cut somewhere else, or they're going to have to borrow. When people say we spent above inflation, this is increases in public health spending from 1979 till 2014. Throughout the entirety of the 2010s, throughout the coalition, and throughout Cameron's premiership, Conservatives would always say, we're increasing NHS spending above inflation. Look at us. We're increasing above inflation. We're like socialists. No, like still under Thatcher in terms of increases to public spending. Way below Major, way below Blair and Brown. Yeah, there's a lot of economic trickery that goes on, and they all do it. Like every single party is guilty of this in one way or the other. For schools, the Conservatives have done another kind of sleight of hand where they say they're going to protect spending in real terms. They've completely protected spending on schools in real terms, which seems really good now because funding for schools per pupil has actually increased. It's a total of £6 billion since 2019 for school funding. Problem is that that's a reversal. That $6 billion increase in school funding is a reversal of cuts that were made from 2010 onwards. So actually, the amount of school funding that we have from the UK government now per pupil in real terms is the same as it was in 2010. So what the Conservatives did is, in real terms, they had the school spending per person, they cut it, and now they're bringing it back. And they're just going to say, we're going to keep it here, which basically means that by 2029, school spending per pupil will be the same in 2029, 2030 as it was in 2010. It'll be 20 years of no advancement in real terms. Manifestos will often, you'll see loads of pictures of the leader. Like, if you look at the Labour manifesto, there are pictures of Keir all over it. Look at this. He's everywhere. Look, he's everywhere. You can't get away from him. Like Rishi Sunak's just like, he's embarrassed. They're embarrassed to show his face. It's just such a, I mean, it's very funny to watch. Like 14 years of this fucking party being in power, the amount of horse shit that they've done, attempting to deport people to Rwanda, spending hundreds of millions on a policy that is insanely unethical, doesn't even account for that many people, and couldn't even get past British Supreme Courts, not just the European Court, the British Supreme Court said it wasn't good enough. Ruining public services and then increasing spending back to what it was when they came in and then saying they've made an improvement. Yeah, it's an embarrassment. Like just a fucking shit show of a spoiled, rotten, cousin fucking weekend at daddy's, casual racist fucking horse fuckers. I don't know, yeah, they're just chinless monsters. Yeah, they're done. They're done. I don't know how they're going to come back, but in their current state, they are done and they deserve it. And it's funny. Okay. That's my take on the Conservative Party manifesto. Okay. Has the average British voter moved right since Blair? Why have the Tories been voted in for 14 years? Most people associated Labour with the financial crash, 2008. They blamed it on Labour's spending. They said that they basically, the entire line in the UK on economics, the mainstream thought in economics for the last 14 years has been Labour spent way too much money. They spent more money than they had. So the country got into debt. The country got into debt. We had the 2008 crash. And we need to cut public spending to make up those losses and get us back out of debt. It's complete nonsense. But that's what that's been the approach. So Labour are always seen as the party that spends more money than the country has and makes the next generation pay for it. That's why Keir Starmer is being very conservative, like literally, like the Conservative Party in terms of how ambitious his spending plans are, and also he doesn't want to look like Corbyn. Yeah, it's like comparing the economy to a household budget. Obviously, the problem is like if I'm in debt, I should stop spending generally because my income will stay roughly the same, and if I stop spending, I'm going to have more money to pay the debt. If you're a government, though, and you reduce your spending, I mean, that can help if the spending's wasteful, for sure. But what if the spending generates revenue? You're a government. You wouldn't tell a business will take out a loan and go into debt to spend money to make money, right? It's not quite the same, but that's just standard Tory austerity doctrine. That's the Conservative Party manifesto. Okay, good. Well done, chat. Any questions? No. I explained everything for you. Well done. Beautiful.